I've played tons of NES games, and more often than not, I approach them as only NES games. Sometimes I forget that many of the wonderful memories we created in our childhood were ports of arcade games. One of the coolest things that I do, personally, when it comes to gaming, is that I check out games by the order they were released, at least in respective franchises. So I always check out the arcade versions first if I'm playing them on Twitch. 7 months ago, JMarks3943 mentioned that it would be interesting to see a video talking about 10 console games that were better than their arcade counterparts, and I agree, it would be an awesome episode, but I think this is a qualifier. The sheer amount of arcade ports on the NES alone would be worth its own video, so instead, I'm going to make this what I call a qualifier. Like I just said, we'll cover all of them as time goes on. As long as I can find 10 of them, generate a list, I'll make it. But for today's episode, I'm going to talk about 10 games that I know for a fact are better than their arcade counterparts. Let's begin. This game will be an interesting thing to talk about. We talk so often, at least I have, about the Nintendo Versus system and how it served to introduce American audiences to the capabilities of the NES and the games that would be available for it. But I haven't made a video talking about the PlayChoice-10, which was the successor to it. I don't mind making a video talking about it, so if you want me to, I will. But for any of you who don't know what the PlayChoice-10 was, it was Nintendo's way of milking you dry for coins. Essentially, you would have a NES game, a physical NES game, in the arcades, and at any point, you could change what game you were playing. Put one credit in, play it for 3 minutes. You could have up to 10 different games inside the machine. Baseball Stars was one of the games that were in the PlayChoice-10. But if you've ever played Baseball Stars, you know that there's so much more than what one measly credit is going to give you. The NES version has 125 games that can be played in a schedule. You win money, and that money can be used to increase the stats of your players. This is a must-play NES title, and while the PlayChoice-10 was more so a glorified demo kiosk, I do feel that it was appropriate to bring up. This was a badass franchise, though. It had 3 games and 1 spiritual relative, and all of them are tremendously fun. Double Dragon is considered by many to be one of the games that defined the beat-em-up genre. The true first beat-em-up that had commercial success was Renegade, made by Technos. Renegade fits the whole Kunio-kun line of games, and it even serves as the first in the franchise, but with the success of Renegade, Yoshihisa Kishimoto wanted to keep that public interest going, and thus Double Dragon was born. In fact, the original plan was to make Double Dragon the sequel of Renegade, but in the end, Billy and Jimmy got their own plot and their own lineage of games. Now in the arcades, at least to me, Double Dragon is a massive coin sink. Hitting anyone is a chore, and even though we have all of these moves that we can use, landing even one of them is borderline impossible. I'm all for coin sinks, but you have to afford the consumer the ability to make progress or learn the game. When the computer is so aggressive that you can't avoid damage, even the saying "get good" goes out the window. This is a get rich kind of thing. The artwork is great, so is the music, and the overall game flow, but to me, the NES version is so much better. Now granted, personally, I don't like Double Dragon. I find it to be a whack-ass downgrade, but when we compare it to the arcade entry, it's significantly more playable. We can actually bring a chain of attacks on the enemy without being interrupted, and the major difference is our moveset. In the NES game, we have to level up. We do that by beating up enemies, and another major difference is that there isn't a 2-player competitive fighting mode. But I never viewed Double Dragon as a tournament fighter, so personally, I didn't give a shit. The final major difference is that we have some, platforming. Yeah, not a big fan of platforming and beat-em-ups, but hey, they give some variety. When I saw this game for years, I thought it was tied to the TV show, you know, the one where James Arness plays Matt Dillon, but no, this is its own game. And if you look at how the game is stylized, you can see a tiny little dot right there. I guess that's one way to avoid a copyright infringement. This is a run and gun game, which I'm always down for. I love vertical shooters, but this one, it's a tough one. We have a joystick and 3 buttons, and depending on which button we press, we shoot a different direction. Think of it as the middle button shoots straight, the left button shoots 45 degrees left, and the right button shoots 45 degrees right. It does have a little bit of a learning curve, but once you get in the groove, it's kind of fun. But I will say it's really hard to discriminate the brown bullets from the brown ground. Say that 10 times fast. It's still a great early shooter from Capcom, but to me, the NES version was just better. Now, the NES version was developed by Capcom as well, but it was published by Romstar. It doesn't really matter, just a little bit of extra information for you. You might be wondering, how is this going to work? How are you going to make 3 directional shots function on a controller that only has 2 buttons? And the answer is, B shoots left, A shoots right, and if we push A and B together, we shoot straight. I'm kind of a weirdo though. I much prefer to shoot at an angle because being mobile and shooting at an angle is just better for me. And I'm weird, I know. Shoot me. At an angle. The NES version doesn't look the best, but it plays wonderfully. We have a new plot, and occasionally we can buy power-ups from the local townfolk. I don't know if that's in the arcade game because I haven't made it that far, but when push comes to shove, I would rather play the NES entry all day, every single day. When you think of Castlevania, you probably think of a time where the game was actually a platformer and not some weird mess of an exploration game. A Metroidvania, if you will. I'm one of those old guys who are resistant to change, and in some ways, I will always prefer the original style of Castlevania games. Now, the first Castlevania was released in 1986. It's one of the best games on the console. A good, clean action platformer where we play as Simon Belmont, going through Dracula's castle with the sole intention of beating the fuck out of him, right? What else could you want? We could fight enemies of monster lore too, like the mummies, the Grim Reaper, Frankenstein's monster, you name it, it was in this game. There were hours of frustration, but damn was it satisfying to beat it. Now you might be asking, when was this in the arcades? Well, it was in the arcades twice. Once on the Nintendo Versus system, and once on the PlayChoice-10, but that's not the arcade game that I want to talk about. I want to talk about the game that came out a year later, Haunted Castle. Haunted Castle is a fucking mistake. We play as a turgid, rigid-ass Simon Belmont walking to the right, dying to anything because our hitbox is as big as the line at the DMV on a Monday, and the difficulty is as hard as trying to squeeze a watermelon through a fucking keyhole, right? It's a fiend. It's just bad. I absolutely hate this game, and it pisses me off that it exists. I'd rather jump ass first into a dildo factory than ever play this game again. Literally every single Castlevania game on the NES is better than Haunted Castle could ever dream of being, right? It sucks more coins than a black hole in a strip club. You will bankrupt yourself trying to beat this. And guess what? Even if you did manage to have some, infinite amount of coins to play this, it suffers from the Konami curse. You only get like 3 lives, and 3 continues before you hard game over. Fuck this game! Now, before we continue, I do want to say that we are working towards a milestone of 8,000 subscribers, and I'd love to have you join me on my retro gaming journey. If we hit it, then I'll do a special video of the community's choice. But you're not here to hear that. Let's get back to the action. I adore Contra, and guess what? I love the sequel even more. Where Contra was so interesting on the NES, Super C turned that knob to an absolute 20 out of 10. It was an absolute blast playing this with my lead moderator, Nick. To compare Contra to Super C is incredibly difficult. It shows that even games that are designed to be difficult can still be fun, and that's something that many companies struggled with, finding that balance between playability and difficulty. But all that goes out the window with the arcade versions. One of the big things that I hate about arcade games is that it exists as a business model. Think of a game you can play but you can never own, at least not until it's ported or the existence of emulation. But that took a long time to come around. Super C in the arcades might look good, but it runs like shit. Our characters cannot move quickly at all, and there's an astronomical amount of bullshit coming our way. One of the big reasons why I enjoy the home console ports so much is that we have a certain degree of flexibility in the characters that we control. Bill and Lance, They can dodge bullets like nobody's business. And I dare remind you, even though the artwork is an arcade quality, this still looks really fucking solid, especially nowadays. It looks great. The only thing I dislike is that we didn't get the 30 life code in America. We got a 10 life code, so thanks Japan, appreciate it. If you're like me, you don't remember Punch-Out being in the arcades, you remember it being one of the most popular NES games for its time. A rhythm game that involves boxing goofy characters, each with their own tells or ticks that allow us to take advantage of them. Then we made it to Mike Tyson, and then he ate a asshole, or Mr. Dream if you had that version. But Punch-Out was first created for the arcades, specifically in 1984. We play as a green-haired character, but he isn't named Little Mac. And we fight characters that we all know. Glass Joe, of course, is the first character, but we see other characters that we know, like Bald Bull or Mr. Sandman. There's quite a few. But there are a few critical flaws in this game. The first is that our character blocks the view of what we're doing. That was fixed with Little Mac being, well, little. 2. Every time we punch, we have to listen to some goofy fuck shout out the move that we're doing. We're constantly hearing,
left, right, body blow. Body blow, left, right, uppercut.
It's incredibly annoying. Lastly, the moves are kind of delayed, right? You can push buttons all that you want. Sometimes it feels that the move just doesn't fire off. All of these issues were dramatically fixed or implemented in a more sensical way with Punch-Out on the NES. We do have limited stamina, but hey, at least we can earn star punches. Oh, and by the way, we can see! That's the big thing for me, being able to see! Fuck! Out of every game that I'm going to talk about in this episode, this was one that I never knew was an arcade game. It's so dramatically different as a NES game that I never even once considered that it had a presence outside of the NES. Naturally, I was excited to check it out, and let me tell you something, both are phenomenal games in their own way. On the NES, we know Ninja Gaiden as a trilogy of hack-and-slash platformers, a franchise that historically has been at the top of most lists that involve hardest NES games for a good reason. To me, it's the litmus test of everything wrong with the NES, so the difficulty stems from that bullshit. But even if I hold disdain for the knockback physics, infinitely spawning enemies, pits of doom and more, it's a much more enjoyable experience than its arcade counterpart. Now, I don't want to knock the arcade game. It's not bad, it's just a different game, damn near completely. We still have platforming elements, but the game is an auto-scrolling beat-em-up, one that doesn't even let us use our sword, unless we pick one up, which is kind of stupid because we have one on our fucking back. All we really do is jump around and kick people, right? It's a kicking simulator. It's basically a better Double Dragon, and that's not saying much because I fucking hate Double Dragon, so sue me. When push comes to shove, the NES version not only is a better game, but it had more of a cultural impact than the arcade version could ever dream of. Oh boy, Rygar. Man, this game is the shit! I love Rygar. What's better than a fucking warrior just decimating anything and everything coming his way with sheer piss and vinegar? And a yo-yo! Not a damn thing! Rygar is a rite of passage game from Tecmo. We play as Rygar, and if I recall, he's just a guy going up against some people known as the Decimators or something. I didn't really pay much attention to the storyline because I'm beating the shit out of people with a razor-edged yo-yo! Now, I will say the arcade game is just a run-of-the-mill hack-and-slash with a yo-yo. That still blows my mind. It's quick, it's something that you pop in a coin and you spend a little time playing, and honestly, in some ways, it loses its charm quickly, at least it did for me. I don't want to sound like a pretentious dick, but I felt it was too easy. I know it gets harder. After all, I did Game Over, so obviously it is difficult, but it didn't appeal to me. When it was ported to the NES, they expanded on the principal plot of Rygar significantly, a lot. We could build up Rygar's tone and his lasting, which is really his health. It's a really stupid way of saying his health. But hey, it needs to feel epic, right? So we'll use words like lasting. Many folks consider this an early Metroidvania, and in some ways it does feel like that. What do you think, though? Feel free to tell us down below. Rygar also uses magic, which I found to be interesting, but at the end of the day, the one thing that pissed me off about this game is that there's no password, there's no battery save either, so this is one of those games that you have to see all the way through in one sitting. There have been other Rygar games like Rygar the Battle of Argus, but to be honest, I prefer this one. Bionic Commando is an example of a game that got a massive facelift when it came time to porting it to the NES. In the arcade game, Takuro Fujiwara yanked this inspiration from Konami's Rock'n Rope, which was a shithole Konami game that he made when he worked with them, right? The key component of Rock'n Rope is the ability to shoot a wire and then climb it. But what if we took away the permanent wire and instead let it be a grappling hook? You'd get Bionic Commando. But even looking at this footage, you can see why I prefer the NES version. The arcade version is just a platformer. It's a pretty shitty one if you ask me. It lacks pretty much everything fun. It's just climbing non-stop. But when it was ported to the NES, whew! What a game. We had a plot, we had a map with different areas or zones we could go to. There were encounters that let us farm lives. There were transponders that we needed to earn. It's easily one of my favorite games on the NES, and for good reason. It's fun, the physics actually work, and the non-linearity offers some degree of challenge, which I appreciate. The shitty thing is that Capcom has nuked this IP into non-relevance, right? Their last few entries have been really rough, and it sucks to see that happen to a legacy franchise, but it is what it is. Companies change their minds, and we as consumers, we just have to deal with it. We all know Contra. It's a gem from Konami, and to me, it's one of those difficult games that deserves to be in every single video game library, at least on principle. Everything that makes Contra what it is, it stemmed from the arcades, but how is it different? Well, in the arcades, we have a much larger sprite artwork, right? Tons of noise, tons of enemies. It's a damn good game, but it has one critical fault, and it's the notorious Konami curse. If you die a certain amount of times, irrelevant to if you have coins in the machine, you will hard game over. Now you might be saying, stop being a bitch. Yeah, maybe I should stop being a bitch. But you gotta look inside for a moment. This was the era where tokens, for me, were scarce. I didn't get an allowance as a kid. To go to an arcade was a luxury experience almost always granted to me by my grandfather. My dad wouldn't give me money for it. He found it to be a waste. So I had to choose games to play that allowed me to continue. Fighting games and light gun games were my favorite. That alone was why the NES version appealed to me as an adult, and with the 30 live code, I could have an honest try at playing a wonderful game on the NES. A fairly faithful one at that. And that's it for today's episode. What did you think of it? Are there any games that come to mind when you compare a home console port to its original arcade iteration? Feel free to share it with the community. Speaking of our community, if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home. We're a group of people dedicated to preserving gaming memories and remembering a time when life was just a little bit easier to live. And if you're into that, feel free to subscribe. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, 45 out.